Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a special pleasure to welcome Dr James Hannam, who has stepped into the breach very nobly. You may have, of course, have seen that Alan Chapman was supposed to have spoken to us this morning originally, but has had a very serious operation from which he's recovering. And James spoke at the Faraday Summer Course quite recently, and he's someone we want to keep coming back as it happens, so it's great that he could come at short notice. James graduated in physics from St Anne's College, Oxford, and has worked then in the City of London, which is where he's back working actually, I think, at the moment. But he took a career break to do a PhD in History and Philosophy of Science here at Pembroke College, Cambridge, and he's produced this wonderful book, God's Philosophers, which is on our bookstall, very much about the science of the medieval period. We tend to think of the scientific revolution as taking place in the 17th century and so on, but there was so much that was going on in that earlier period too, which James has written about. And that book has actually been shortlisted for the Royal Society Science Book Prize 2010. So that's very, very exciting. And very much looking forward to this talk, Science and Christianity, a Historical Sketch. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I was asked to give a talk about the history of science and religion. That is an absolutely enormous subject, much the same size in fact as the history of science. So in my hour of allotted time, I've taken two shortcuts. The first is that I'm really going to restrict what I'm talking about to the relationship between Christianity and science rather than religion generally. And secondly, I've decided I'm going to concentrate on 4 case studies, although they are probably the 4 areas of the relationship between science and Christianity which would spring to anybody's mind. But before I do that, I think it's a good idea if I talk briefly about what is probably in most people's minds still the dominant thesis about how science and Christianity have interacted over the centuries. Most people still seem to think that there has been some kind of eternal conflict. And the conflict thesis itself is actually a historical artifact. It originated in the 16th, 17th centuries in battles between Catholics and Protestants. We find in the work, for instance, of Sir Francis Bacon in the late 16th, early 17th century, that he was claiming that Catholics were backwards in science even that early. Indeed, the popular myth that people thought that the earth was flat in the Middle Ages, the earliest reference I found to it is in the work of Sir Francis Bacon. But the conflict thesis really became popular during the 18th century in France, where the philosophers of the Enlightenment used it as a weapon against the Catholic Church and against the ancient regime. Voltaire said that medieval philosophy, bastard daughter of Aristotle's philosophy, badly translated and understood, caused more error for reason and good education than the Huns and the Vandals. That is an attack on the Catholic Church's philosophy, which during the 18th century was entirely based on the work of St Thomas Aquinas. And D'Alembert, in his great encyclopedia, so the front cover we can see here, wrote a potted history of what he saw as the great conflict between progress and science and religion and superstition. But ironically, at exactly the time that D'Alembert and Voltaire were making these claims. The Jesuits, Catholic priests, of course, were beavering away, producing really vast amounts of science. Something like 6,000 scientific papers until the order was suppressed for political reasons in 1773, including about a third of the pioneering papers on electricity and magnetism. But for us in the English-speaking world, the conflict thesis really dates from the 19th century, and in particular the works of two American authors, John William Draper, who wrote the history of the conflict between science and religion, and Andrew Dixon White, who wrote history of the warfare between science and theology. It has to be said that White's book is slightly more serious and slightly more scholarly, although today's scholars don't take either of them particularly seriously. But what's important about these two people is that they were using the conflict thesis as a way to fight battles of their own. In particular, Andrew Dixon White was trying to found a new university, Cornell University in New York, America, and he wanted the university to be completely independent of ecclesiastical control. And as far as he was concerned, that meant that there wasn't going to be a single clergyman on the Board of Governors. And this was quite unpopular at the time, as you might imagine. So for him, writing this book about the conflict between theology and science was part of his campaign to show that Cornell University should be kept independent of any kind of religious affiliation. And over here in England, of course, T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, he famously said in his review of Darwin's Origin of Species, published in a journal called the Westminster Review, but I think nothing to do with this college, extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as strangled snakes beside that of Hercules. Now that statement was complete rubbish, but for Huxley it was very important that he was able to distinguish between science on one hand and religion on the other, because he was engaged in his own struggle to try and bring the professional status of scientists up to the same level that clergymen already enjoyed in England. He thought that the clergy and indeed the amateur gentlemen scientists, who were very often vicars, had far too much control over English society. He thought that science was the future, and he therefore was keen to exploit this idea of conflict between science and religion as a way of forwarding his own political aims. And I'm going to come back to Huxley when we talk about Darwin. I can't leave the conflict thesis without running through a few of the myths that have been thrown up. If you spend as much time as I do, and I don't recommend this, arguing with people on the internet about science and religion, you will eventually come across every single one of these myths. And I think it's worth just briefly running through them, because they do still seem to come up even among journalists, even occasional historians who really should know better. The most ubiquitous one, of course, is the flat earth, that people in the Middle Ages, because the church was telling them that, thought the earth was flat. I've been assured that scores of people were burnt at the stake for stating that the earth was a sphere. None of this ever happened. And you would not find a single record of anybody saying that the earth is flat in Western Europe after about 400 BC. There are a few Greek Orthodox bishops who were writing in the 5th century AD, but they had no influence on the West, and precious little influence, I'm pleased to say, on the Greek world. It's often said that Columbus proved that the Earth is a sphere. I'm not sure how he was supposed to manage this, simply by sailing to America. Ferdinand Magellan, of course, was the first man to sail around the world, but he didn't prove it was a sphere either. And in fact, there is a popular story in a medieval geography book by Sir John Mandeville about somebody who had circumnavigated the world in the 14th century. The story is fiction, but people were certainly aware that it was possible at the time. And Columbus wasn't told that he shouldn't try and sail for America because anybody was worried about him sailing off the edge of the Earth. The difficulty was that Columbus thought the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. And if it wasn't for the fact that America had intervened to save him and his crew, he would have died in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, because the distance that he was actually trying to sail was from Spain to the Philippines, which is far more than he ever would have been able to manage. Banning lightning rods. Now this comes from the work of Andrew Dixon White. He got confused because in the 18th century it was thought that earthquakes might be caused by lightning striking the ground. And furthermore, of course, you'll be aware that putting a lightning rod in a building actually attracts the lightning but then renders it harmless. So there was an argument as to whether attracting lightning to your church was a terribly good idea. But it certainly was not the case that anybody pronounced that putting a lightning rod on a building was getting around God's ability to nuke people with lightning bolts if he was feeling like it. Banning zero. Well, this actually appears in a recent book by the atheist scientist Peter Atkins. He said that the cardinals were trying to ban zero, and this had held back science in the Middle Ages. And there was Charles Seif managed to write an entire book called Zero, the biography of a dangerous idea, about 10 years ago, without ever realizing that his central thesis had no evidence to support it at all. As you'll probably know, we use what we call Arabic numerals. They come, in fact, from India. And when Arabic numerals first appeared in Western Europe, people didn't actually know what order they were supposed to be in. And so the actual symbol used for particular numbers varied almost from town to town. It wasn't until about the 15th century that there was universal agreement over which symbol should mean which figure. And laws were passed to try and either tell people that they had to use Roman numerals until the confusion had passed, or at least set down which figures were supposed to be used. As far as I can tell, that's where the banning of zero myth might have come from. I do like the fact that our symbol for 5, they use 0, or what we use as 0 for 5 in the Middle East. They use the symbols in a different order. Somehow we ended up with different ones for each number. Excommunicating Halley's Comet. This is my all-time favourite. According to Carl Sagan in his book on comets, Pope Callistus III excommunicated the comet in 1456. It's something of an irony that Carl Sagan produced in one of his later books something he calls a baloney detection kit. And it's a great shame that he never used it on himself. Banning human dissection. Human dissection has been forbidden in almost every society in history. Briefly, in ancient Greek Alexandria, dissection, or even worse, I'm sorry to say, vivisection of prisoners may have taken place. But by the time the Romans came along, human dissection was out, and even the great ancient physician Galen was unable to dissect humans. He had to use apes, which led to him making a number of mistakes. Human dissection reappeared in Italy in the 13th, 14th century. It looks like it started because post-mortem examinations to establish cause of death were being done. Generally, some of the earliest we have on the orders of the Pope, trying to establish what was causing the Black Death. And that, therefore, almost inevitably led to human dissection becoming part of medical training. There is a papal bull which says that you're not allowed to boil bodies to render the flesh from the bones. This was something that was popular with crusaders. They wanted to be buried back home if they had died in the Middle East, and it was much easier to take just the bones back rather than taking a whole body, which might have smelt a bit by the time it actually got home. For reasons which I don't quite understand, the Pope did take a dislike of this and ban the practice, but did not ban human dissection. And burning scientists at the stake never happened. Not, as far as I've been able to find, a single person has ever been burnt at the stake for scientific ideas. The closest example that people tend to bring up is the unfortunate case of Giordano Bruno, who was burnt in Rome in 1600. Unfortunately, because Napoleon's soldiers stole all the records at the end of the 18th century, we do not know precisely what it was that Bruno was burnt for. But we do know that it wasn't for saying that the Earth goes around the Sun. That wasn't on any of the indictments at all. And indeed, his scientific statements he makes can all be found in a quite popular book called On Learned Ignorance by Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa from about a century and a half before. Even the Catholic Church will not burn you at the stake for repeating the opinions of a cardinal. So the conflict myth, I just feel I have to run through these things because they do come up. What should we put in its place? Well, the great recently retired historian of science and religion, John Hedley Brooke, suggested that instead of the conflict thesis, the conflict narrative, we have something called the complexity narrative. And that's sensible enough because his main idea was that we have to look at historical events within the context that they were happening, rather than trying to jam them into some meta-theory which is supposed to cover the whole of history. I don't much like the complexity thesis idea because I think we can be a little bit more precise than that. The phrase that I like to use for the overall relationship between science and Christianity is one of creative tension, because I think there are tensions and I think we should not hide away from those. But it's a fact that many of the greatest men of science have been unusually religious. Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton, of course, Joseph Priestley, Michael Faraday, George Mendel. These are men who, even by the standards of their own time, were unusually devout, even though, in fact, of course, in the case of Newton and Priestley, they weren't particularly orthodox. And today, we still have very religious scientists. John Polkinghorne, of course, the physicist from Cambridge, who's now retired. Simon Coleman-Morris, who is still working at Cambridge on evolutionary biology, and I had the privilege of meeting him here at the Faraday Institute in the summer. Francis Collins, an evangelical Christian who led the Human Genome Project. A man who, Christopher Hitchens, who, as I'm sure you heard, is unfortunately suffering from cancer. In one of his articles on his cancer, he said that Collins had come to visit him to discuss various possible treatments, and he described Collins as one of the greatest living Americans. Not bad praise from Christopher Hitchens. And also, I think we mustn't hide away from this, there have been specific instances of conflict between different scientific beliefs and different Christian beliefs. Creationism is an obvious one. Copernicus and Galileo. Galileo, of course, is an obvious case of conflict. The idea, which I think some Christians have suggested, that it's all been sweetness and light for the last 2,000 years between science and religion, I don't think we can really maintain. I think we have to accept that there have been positive and less positive interactions. I do love this cartoon of global warming and the Bible, science and religion finally agree that the world is about to end. More often than conflict, however, I think that religion provides science with alternative perspectives. It inspires and motivates scientists to do the work that they do. It provides a metaphysical background for science. It means science makes sense. And it provides, I think in some cases, some sort of theories for science, some ideas for what might be the right idea. Famous example is the Big Bang, which was first suggested by a Belgian Jesuit. When Fred Hoyle, who was a physicist here from the 50s to the 80s, I think, first heard about it, he was an avowed atheist who thought the universe couldn't possibly have a beginning. He was the one who coined the idea that it should be called the Big Bang theory. It caught on, but Hoyle was not trying to be flattering. So 4 case studies. The Middle Ages, because that's what I do. I'm most interested in science in the Middle Ages, and I'm interested in rehabilitating the period as an era of scientific advance. Copernicus and Galileo, and what went wrong for Galileo. The Enlightenment, the period we saw where the conflict thesis really found legs. And finally, Darwin and evolution during the 19th century, when the conflict thesis, of course, became popular in the English-speaking world as well. Well, much of what most people believe about science in the Middle Ages, I think, is probably wrong, not least the lack of scientists being devoted to the state. I think the Middle Ages were actually an era of reason, when logic was taken to heights that it probably didn't see again until the 19th century. During the Renaissance, medieval logic was thought to be rather useless, and as a result it was neglected for several centuries. It took a long time before it was realised just how much important work had been done. And theology in the Middle Ages was very often taught as an entirely rational subject. And that was the reason that logic was considered to be so important. You had to have formal training in logic before you were allowed to tackle higher subjects such as philosophy and theology. Another great invention of the Middle Ages is the university. And of course we are in a medieval university here, founded, they say, in 1209. These universities were a completely new invention because they were independent corporations. They didn't, in fact, owe their existence to a rich individual who could close it down if they wanted to. They didn't owe their existence to the monarchy or even quite to the church, although the church was obviously terribly important to the existence of the universities. They had a kind of special status, and that meant that they were able to play off monarchies against bishops and emperors against popes in order to try and cement their own position. And this gave them an amazing degree of independence. And it meant that you could say things and teach things and write things within the university's environment that you probably couldn't get away with in the outside world. And there were occasional crises when some of the rather heretical ideas that were making the rounds in the universities leaked into common people living around it, and at that point the church would get terribly worried. But as long as ideas were just considered to be things you could argue about within the university, it was there was much more intellectual freedom than you might imagine. And also during the Middle Ages, I think that Christianity had an extremely positive relationship with what we call science, which they called natural philosophy, which isn't exactly the same as modern science for a number of reasons. It wasn't terribly mathematical, and it was very much the study of God's creation. That's what they were interested in. But that positive relationship extended not only to the insistence that people who wanted to study theology first had to get a solid grounding in natural philosophy, but also that there were certain what I call metaphysical foundations of science that were laid down in the Middle Ages that we now take completely for granted, regardless of whether or not we happen to be believers. And of course, medieval science, I think, made important advances, and those advances, although we don't tend to associate them with the Middle Ages anymore, found their way into the work of Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, and have hence been transported into modern science. Now, the metaphysical foundations, I just want to run through these because I think they're important for showing us the way that Christianity and science can have a very positive interaction. Everyone agreed in the Middle Ages that God created the universe. There wasn't any question over that. So God was the primary cause of absolutely everything. But you could legitimately ask the question, well, how did he do it? And how does he keep the world turning the way that he would like? And that becomes a question for the natural philosopher. The natural philosopher can look at the secondary causes that God had ordained, what we might call the laws of nature, which do God's work in the world. And therefore, you have a fairly clear demarcation between God as primary cause, the sphere of theology, and God's laws that he's ordained, the secondary causes, the sphere of natural philosophy. And there's no reason that the natural philosopher is not doing anything wrong by investigating the secondary causes. It was also believed, and this came through very much in the 12th century, that the reason that we can understand nature at all, the reason that there are natural laws, is that nature reflects the character of its creator. God isn't capricious. When God says something is something, that's the way it stays. So the laws of nature are going to be the same. You don't have to worry about God stepping in arbitrarily to muck up whatever you're trying to do. It means that science, as an enterprise, makes sense. And what about miracles? Well, God, of course, certainly through the medieval mind does miracles all over the place. God can step in at any time he likes to interact directly with the world. But no matter how common you think a miracle is, you always think it's a miracle, which by definition means that it is a change from the ordinary course of nature. And you can usually, because of what we know about God's character, rely on him not being arbitrary about what he's doing. And so natural philosophy can study the ordinary course of nature without necessarily having to worry about stepping on God's toes or by having its work, because miracles happen, natural philosophy might simply not be something that was worth studying. Another idea, which you might think is originates with the ancient Greeks, but one of the earliest expressions of it I can find is by a medieval Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Bradwardine, in the 14th century, that the language of nature is a language of mathematics. If you're trying to do physics, there is very little point in doing that unless you've already got a grounding in maths. It's often said that above Plato's academy in ancient Greece, it was said that he who knows nothing of geometry not enter here. But actually that's a myth too. Dates from the 12th century, not long before Bradwardine declared that you needed to marry mathematics and physics to understand nature. And finally, the ancient Greeks, particularly Aristotle, thought that the way to do natural philosophy, the way to understand the world, was simply to look at it, observe it, and then sit down and think very hard. For him, there was no question of having to do experiments. He was a great observer, particularly in natural history, was Aristotle. But because he was so convinced that the world had to be totally rational, and rational meant for Aristotle what he happened to think was rational, he made really very bad mistakes in his science, believing, for instance, that a heavy object and a light object, if you drop them, the heavy object will fall faster. Christian said, well, actually, no, you can't simply figure out how the world works by using pure reason. And the reason for this is that God is a free agent. God can create the world in any way he likes. And in order to find out the way he's actually done it, we have to go out there and look, firstly through observation, but also later through experiment, an idea which is fully formed in the work of René Descartes. So the central failings of Aristotle's natural philosophy, which led to him being wrong about so much, were defeated by this idea that there's a free God who is able to create a world in a way that Aristotle might have disagreed with. And in order to find out the way that he did it, we have to carry out empirical and experimental work. And the scientific achievements of the Middle Ages, it wasn't just people thinking great thoughts, they actually were concrete advances. The most famous is the mean speed theorem. Now that happens to be the mathematical formula which describes the way that when you drop an object it falls to the ground under gravity. And people in the Middle Ages didn't actually realise that, but they did do the mathematics to prove the way that a constantly accelerating object would move. And they were then set about proving that graphically. This chap, Nicolas Rem, who was a French bishop, he was the first person to use graphs in order to track motion and to prove the way that things work through linking geometry to the real world in a way that Euclid never did. And in particular, he came up with the revolutionary idea that an area under a graph could correspond to a distance in the real world. So two different things can be linked in a mathematical way. And this is his proof here on the side of a manuscript. It's very nice and simple, but what we have to remember is that the mathematical tools and symbols that we take for granted today just didn't exist in the Middle Ages. So if they wanted to write a very simple equation, they had to write it out in full, and it would take 3 or 4 lines. And this here is a 15th century book which contains the same proof. And this here is the same proof in Galileo's Dialogues Concerning Two New Sciences, published in 1638. It's fairly apparent, it's even more apparent if you have a look at what the writing is, that this is the same proof being used by all 3 authors, although Galileo doesn't say so. Relative motion and the rotation of the Earth. Well, we all know that Copernicus was the one who first suggested that the Earth was orbiting the Sun. But in the Middle Ages, in the 14th century, it was often discussed whether the Earth might be rotating and why we wouldn't be able to feel this. And Nicolas Rem's teacher, Jean Burdin, master at the University of Paris, he explained, well, if you're on a boat and you see another boat, and one of you is moving and the other one isn't, it's not actually possible to tell simply by looking at the two boats which one is moving and which one is stationary. And the same is the case with the Earth rotating. We can't tell simply from looking up at the sky and seeing the stars going around us whether the stars are moving or whether we are moving. And if we're simply moving steadily like a boat, which is moving at a constant speed, we won't feel anything. So we can't use physics to decide whether or not the Earth is moving. Nicolas Rems then went through the whole Bible, and he decided that practically every mention in the Bible of the Earth being stationary could be interpreted in a figurative way, exactly the way that they would interpret anything in the Bible that suggests that the Earth is flat, because of course nobody would believe that. And eventually I think he came to one passage in the Psalms which says that the Earth has been put on its foundations and nothing may move it. And he thought, well, that probably is conclusive enough for me, so I will say that the Earth isn't moving. But the method that he used of a figurative interpretation of the Bible was exactly the same one that Galileo tried to use in his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina when he was trying to explain that his Copernican theory was not incompatible with Scripture. Impetus theory, this was something which Jean Burdin developed, which is very similar to Newton's first law, I think. Impetus is very similar to the momentum. It's not exactly the same, but very similar, and a huge improvement over Aristotle's ideas of motion. And one of the things that Burdin realized was that if you set something, say a planet, which is what he was talking about, in motion and there's no friction, there's nothing to stop it, it will keep going forever. Whereas Aristotle had said that the moment you stop moving something, it will stop. Nothing can move unless there is something moving it. And Aristotle actually turned that principle into proof of the existence of God, that God has to keep the whole world moving, because if he stopped, the world would stop, that it can't maintain itself. And Burdin was able to show that, in fact, this isn't the case at all, and that if you start something, it will keep going until something stops it. Human dissection I've mentioned already, that began in Italian medical schools and was spread all over Europe by the end of the Middle Ages. And finally, technological advance. And the Middle Ages was a fantastically inventive time. Not only did they suck ideas in from around the world, Arabic numerals, a compass and gunpowder from China, stirrup from the Russian steppe. They also did lots of inventing of their own. Mechanical clocks, absolutely staggeringly important invention in the late 13th century. Spectacles invented around about the same time, something I'm obviously very grateful for. Less happily, weaponry, and they took gunpowder from China, but the gun is definitely a European invention. And finally, printing. Although you can find all the elements of printing being used in the Far East and limited printing going on in Korea, it was only with Gutenberg in Germany in the mid-15th century that we saw printing becoming an industry, with all the changes and importance of that. So, I mean, my takeaway point, I think, is simply that people imagined that the Middle Ages was an era of faith and superstition when the church was holding back science. And I'm saying, no, the church wasn't holding back science, and by the way, the Middle Ages was an era of reason and scientific advance. And we've forgotten all that. And I think we should because the Middle Ages is supposed to be the typical period where the conflict thesis takes most of its nourishment, if we understand what science and religion were really like in the Middle Ages, we are a very long way to showing that the conflict thesis is simply untenable. Copernicus is my next case study. He published his great book, De Revolutionibus, in 1543, and he was on his deathbed when it was finally published. But he had circulated his ideas to interested parties in manuscript and in a short pamphlet for years before. There's often said that he published very late in life because he was frightened of the potential persecution he was going to suffer. This isn't the case. He was urged to publish by no less than a cardinal. He dedicated his book to the Pope, which is just the thing you did in those days. The Pope had more than one other piece of science dedicated to him. I very much doubt he read any of it. But for Copernicus, his central worry was that it was going to be his colleagues, the other mathematicians and natural philosophers, who told him that he was being silly. He was more worried about bad reviews than he was about religious persecution. I know how he feels. And it is the case that before 1600 there were very, very few people who thought Copernicus was right. His work was reprinted. It was relatively successful. There's actually a recent book about the revolutionists called The Book That Nobody Read. But the people who could understand it, a very dense book in Latin containing cutting-edge geometry, they did read it, and it was used. It was even used by the Catholic Church as part of the calendar reform of the Gregorian calendar. But Copernicus wasn't able to prove that he was right. He couldn't prove that the Earth goes round the Sun. And the system he uses of insisting that planets can only use circular motion meant that, in fact, his theory wasn't really very much more accurate than the very best Greek theories with the Earth stationary and the Sun and all the planets going around it. And it wasn't until the work of Johannes Kepler, who published some staggeringly accurate astronomical tables in the 1630s. And these tables were so accurate, so much better than anything that had gone before. People immediately realized that what Kepler was using to calculate his tables, and that was elliptical orbits, planets and Earth going around the Sun in elliptical orbits, had to be a better explanation of what went before. And it seems to be that, in the 17th century, that really convinced Europe that the Earth did go around the Sun together with the other planets. It probably wasn't this chap. Galileo was one of the earliest people to believe Copernicus was right. He wrote to Kepler in 1597, claiming, yeah, I'm on your side and I've been on your side for years. But ironically, he never used Kepler's elliptical orbits, and that meant that he was never in possession of the most cutting-edge science in order to prove his point that the Earth really did go around the Sun. But this idea was boiling away in the early 17th century. And in 1616, in what can only be called a catastrophic error, the Catholic Church declared that Copernicus' ideas were ridiculous as far as philosophy was concerned, i.e. they were scientifically wrong, which actually wasn't that much of a controversial statement, but also that they conflicted with a reading of Scripture. It's not entirely, it's still debated by scholars exactly what pushed them into doing this, but the figure at the centre of the dispute was a Jesuit cardinal by the name of Robert Bellamy, and he was unusually, perhaps for a Catholic, a biblical literalist, and he rejected Aristotle's science on the grounds that it couldn't be found in the Bible. He rejected Copernicus for exactly the same reasons. He did say that if Copernicus' theory could be scientifically proved, he would believe it and reinterpret the Bible accordingly. But he wasn't going to do that until someone could absolutely convince him. And unfortunately, at that time, the evidence simply wasn't available. But after 1616, Bellarmine died, and then a new pope was elected, Pope Urban VIII, who was a Florentine like Galileo, and was also a good friend of his because Galileo had helped Pope Urban's rather extensive family into a few positions by writing references. Pope Urban's nephews tended to become cardinals. He was that kind of a pope. And Galileo thought that his friendship with Urban was such that he could probably get away with flouting the ban. But unfortunately, it turned out that when the Pope read the book which resulted, the famous dialogue on two chief world systems, he got the impression that Galileo had actually insulted him by placing one of his own arguments in the mouth of the character in the dialogue who's the butt of all the jokes. Anyway, the Pope exploded with rage when he wrote this. Galileo was hauled in front of the Inquisition for breaking the ban of 1616 and eventually sentenced to house arrest for life. Big mistake by the Church that it spent the last 400 years trying to correct. Now, a lot of historians, and I'm one of them, don't particularly like labelling historical periods the Enlightenment or whatever, but I can live with the Enlightenment because it was actually coined at the time by Immanuel Kant. During the 18th century, this is after Newton's work electrified the scientific world because he seems to suggest, although Newton would never have believed this himself, that the universe was simply one enormous great mechanical machine that simply didn't need God to work. And that idea was introduced into France by Voltaire and his lover, Madame Châtelet. She actually translated Newton's Principia into French, still the only translation that there is in French. And Voltaire wrote a sort of a popular level introduction to Newton. And Newton was grist for the Enlightenment philosophers. They were often materialists and deists, and they loved the idea of the universe being this great machine that didn't need God, or God could have created at the beginning of time and then walked away from. But it's kind of ironic that the actual great scientists of the time didn't really follow the philosophers. Many of them, although by no means all, were devout Christians. And it's what you might call the camp followers of science during the 18th century, perhaps more than the scientists themselves, who were the rebels against theistic religion. As far as the philosophers were concerned, well, it was really just a case for them of trying to battle against what they perceived, not incorrectly, of the Catholic Church being a very conservative institution that was an obstacle to social progress. It was an institution which was buttressing the monarchy and the absolutist rule of France. And so they brought science in as a weapon to use against the church. But the scientists of the Enlightenment, starting with Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was an Arian. He denied the divinity of Jesus, and whether or not that makes him not a Christian or not, I don't know. I would think he is a Christian, but he was devoutly religious, and he spent very much more of his time on theology and biblical chronology than he did on his physics, and incidentally a great deal of time on alchemy as well. Joseph Priestley, he was another unorthodox but highly devout scientist. He was a dissenting minister who through his life gradually developed into a Unitarian. And he again, if he had been asked what his most important work had been during his life, he would have said it was his theology, which echoed much of what we call the higher criticism of the 19th century. And he also had radical politics. He was a supporter of the French Revolution. And this meant that possibly officially instigated riot burnt his house down in 1794 in Birmingham, and he fled to Pennsylvania in order to escape from persecution. But it's kind of ironic because in chemistry, Priestley, of course, discovered oxygen, although he didn't call it oxygen and didn't really recognise what it was, but he did discover it first of all. The person who figured out what oxygen was, the father of modern chemistry, was Lavoisier, a French upper-class tax farmer. And he has the unfortunate distinction of being the only great scientist ever to have been executed. And he was guillotined in 1794 during the French Revolutionary Terror by the Jacobins, who were anti-Catholic and thought they worshipped reason, which just goes to show what a bad idea that is. And finally, I think I should certainly mention Michael Faraday, of which the Faraday Institute is named after. He was a member of really quite an ascetic sect called the Sandemanians. And this meant that he would eschew politics, he would refuse honours. In his later life, he was often addressed as Sir Michael because he was so important and so famous that people just assumed he must have a knighthood. But for religious reasons, he wouldn't accept one. He did accept a royal pension, but that was because by the time he accepted it, the scandal that he hadn't got one was so great that it would have been more of a political statement to say no than it was to say yes. And Faraday, of course, the discoverer of so many important electromagnetic phenomena at the laboratory of the Royal Institution in London. I just want to mention this picture and the other one you may well know, which is like it of the air pump and a very expensive bird being suffocated, which you would never see in reality. Because I think this picture gives us an idea of when the scientist, although this was painted in the 18th century before the word scientist had actually been coined, became something of a almost sinister figure. There was a romantic reaction against science at the end of the 18th century. We see the writing of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a typical example of that. So, but the Romantics weren't Christian, they weren't conventionally religious, they came from a wide range of background. But it just demonstrates that opposition to science isn't simply a religious occupation. There's lots of other reasons that people have been suspicious of it. Finally, I should move on to my last case study of evolution and Darwin. Now the Earth has been very old. It might be very old. Has been an idea which has been around for a long time, but there's always been something that has been a bit of a fringe theory because it's so difficult to show it. And in 1830, Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which demonstrated that a gradualist explanation of how the Earth reached its form was probably the most logical one, was what you might call the first solid scientific evidence that the Earth might be much, much older than the Bible suggests. Although Lyell, incidentally, was also a Christian who didn't seem to find there was very much problem reconciling his science and his belief. Evolution had also been around for quite a while before Darwin. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he suggested the evolution through acquired characteristics at the beginning of the 19th century. His full name was Jean-Baptiste Pierre Antoine de Monet Chevalier de Lamarck, which is a bit of a mouthful, so Lamarck will have to do. And he thought that animals would strive and that they would improve over their lifetimes and they could pass these characteristics onto their young. And the classic example is a giraffe striving to reach high leaves, thus its neck grows longer, and therefore it its children will have longer necks. Lamarck was effectively saying that if you go down the gym a lot, you will have more muscular children, which people liked because it suggested that evolution had a direction and there was some sort of control over where it was going. But of course it's not actually true. Erasmus Darwin was another early evolutionary thinker. He was Charles Darwin's grandfather, and he wrote a very successful poem in the late 18th century called The Loves of Plants. And what this did was help you through poetry to identify different plants by the number of stamens or petals that they had. And it was about the last time that anybody thought it was worth putting a serious scientific work into poetry. And the reason it was the last time that anyone tried it was that shortly afterwards a vicious satire came out which was called The Loves of Triangles. And that was the end of Darwin's literary career, unfortunately. He never lived it down. He also wrote an evolutionary poem called The Temple of Nature, which was not published until after he died. And finally, in 1844, Robert Chambers, an Edinburgh publisher, anonymously wrote a book called The Vestiges of Creation, which was massively controversial. It had an evolutionary view of the whole universe. It didn't give you very much hard scientific fact, but it did present the idea that the universe had been created perhaps at the beginning of the time and then was just working itself out over a vast time period afterwards. And all of this meant that when Darwin was developing his ideas, evolution was in the air, and it also meant that when he finally published his ideas in 1859, partly of course because he'd heard that he was about to be trumped to the press by Wallace's own evolutionary theory, it wasn't quite as radical as is often suggested. What Darwin did, which was new, was he developed a mechanism for evolution, natural selection. And previously there hadn't really been one apart from Lamarck's, and Lamarck's, for reasons we've discussed, didn't seem to be a very good idea. And his book was controversial, but it went through multiple reprints. It sold an awful lot of copies. And I mean, it wasn't banned. It wasn't even banned by the index of banned books in the Vatican, although I understand that his next book, The Descent of Man, was so listed. And the controversy at the time wasn't that things might be evolving. People could live with that. It was the position of human beings. Where did mankind fit into the tree of life? And a lot of people were happy to see the entire animal kingdom evolving, but they wanted human beings to be placed on a pedestal that they alone had been specially created. And it's interesting that the famous monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee of 1925, which is often said that John Scopes was put on trial for teaching evolution. In fact, the law was against teaching that humans had evolved from apes. Evolution, for more general creatures was considered to be acceptable even then. Darwin was quite careful in The Origin of Species really to say almost nothing about human beings at all. I think he said at the very end, light may be shed on the origin of humans. And even The Descent of Man, which you might think was mainly about people, was actually mainly about sexual selection. So he never really went out of his way to be controversial about human origins, although there's absolutely no doubt about what he thought. This was a man who was more than happy to be controversial. T.H. Huxley. He came from a relatively humble background. His father had been a maths teacher, but had fallen on hard times, and there was no social security or anything, so he had to work his way up from the bottom of society, and he reached the top pretty much through science. And as far as he was concerned, science should be a career path which had as as much respect as, say, the clergy. Now, he had a famous debate over evolution in 1860 on the 30th of June with Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford. And again, it's interesting to note that Wilberforce and Huxley agreed on a great deal. Huxley was never really convinced by natural selection. And Wilberforce had also got some reservations about Darwin's theory. But it was over the question of whether humans themselves had evolved that Huxley and Wilberforce really parted company, and the famous question of Wilberforce asking Huxley whether he was descended from an ape on his mother's or father's side came up. Huxley had no problem being descended from an ape. He did, however, feel that natural selection had the potential to undermine ethics, and he never quite came to terms with it. But he was forthright in defending Darwin because he thought that Darwinism really did help him with his political struggles for the separation of science and religion. So if I could just sum up some takeaway points. The conflict thesis, we still hear about it, but historians have really finished with it. In its place we have the complexity thesis, or what I prefer to call creative tension. As historians, what we have to do is examine historical events within the context of their own time, rather than trying to fit them into great meta-narratives. And finally, where there have been conflicts between science and religion, it's often a good idea to look behind them and find out if that might actually simply be a proxy for some other struggle, rather than actually being a real metaphysical conflict between different ways of thinking. So thank you very much indeed. I think some of these books are available at the back, but I think they're probably, well, that one of course is not. But these are good introductions to the current thinking among historians about the historical relationship between science and religion. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That's very helpful. I'm sure that will have given some questions. Yes.
It seems this kind of potted approach doesn't seem to be any different to where we are today. Would you make any comments about that? Because presumably we learn from history, and presumably it's not going to change much in the way science and religion is going to kind of battle each other, and in some ways.
But I don't hear very well.
Oh yes,
sorry,
can you speak?
Sorry.
Yes, I think the question is whether we're in the same kind of position today as your potted overview. I guess that's it. Well, we've got Darwin's Rottweiler today, and
we do.
Rather than his
bulldog.
Yes,
I think today we do see a very real conflict between creationism and evolution. But I think, although that is a conflict between a particular scientific view and a particular religious view, a scientific view which I happen to think is completely true, I should say, and a religious view which I would disagree with, that is not an ontological conflict between science and religion. There are huge numbers of people who are comfortable with evolution, who are Christians, who are religious. I think creationism is in part a reaction against some of the philosophical claims which are made for science. Science is an all-encompassing metaphysical explanation for all of reality, and that evolution is supposed to explain exactly what we are, how we behave, and has no room for God, for morality, or real morality, for free will, that sort of thing, which I don't think are scientifically justifiable statements. So I think that conflict is one which, again, we should be perhaps to some extent looking behind to try and understand what the motivations of people on both sides really might be.
Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned Korean printing. What other studies have you done on the other parts of the world, such as the Arab scientists in Spain, and perhaps Hindu scientists and things that are happening elsewhere?
Well, I have done certain amount of work on Islamic science, and there's no doubt that Western Europe inherited a lot of important work from Islamic thinkers, most particularly in the field of mathematics. That was really, I think, where they excelled. And it's interesting that buried deep within Copernicus' De Revolutionibus, the model that he uses for the moon and the model he uses, I think, for the precession of the equinoxes, both seem to come directly from work that was being done by Persian astronomers in the 14th century. It's quite difficult to, we don't know how that knowledge actually reached Europe, or probably through Italy, where Copernicus had been studying at university. And as far as Hindu science is concerned, most of that reached the West through the Arab world. Of course, what we call Arabic numerals are actually Hindu numerals from Italy, and I'm from India. And again, it seems to be largely mathematics which eventually fed into modern science from that source.
Thank you. Yes, Brad.
I remember a story of, I think during the Ptolemaic era, of estimating the circumference of the world. What era was that?
When was the circumference of the Earth measured first?
That was done in Alexandria by Aristophanes. And he was about 10% too big, I think, something like that. And he did it by noting when the sky was directly overhead and he could see the sun was directly overhead and he could see the reflection of the sun at the bottom of a well in two different places at two different times, and then he paced out the distance between them, and that told him he knew what the angle of the incidence was at both places. He knew the distance, and he simply multiplied out to find out how big the Earth was. If you ever walk something like 200 miles,
Yeah, well, it's not bad, is it? What date was that?
about 10% out.
Yeah, the date.
That was about 250 BC, I think.
Yeah, 250 BC, and to be within 10%. I think that's not bad. More questions? Yes.
Sorry,
Yeah.
stay with me. Similar to the first question, I wonder if I could push you a bit more about the contemporary, why you think, or do you have any comments on why this rise of a new atheism, confrontational atheism, and the rise of a fundamentalist Christian position, that if it has been not so much conflict through the ages, why this conflict today in a modern, where we would hope there was more kind of overlap and response? Why has this conflict arisen today?
Well, the causes of new atheism remains slightly controversial, but my own feeling is that it simply came to prominence because of 9/11. I think that's why it happened. And I think that perhaps in the interest of fairness, and perhaps because it's not the wisest thing to do to attack Islamic fundamentalists, Christianity has become something of a proxy as far as the new atheists are concerned. They are attacking all religion, but they are attacking the dominant religion in their own environment in particular. But I think the real target is the minority of Muslims who take fundamentalist views. I think that is what has caused the new atheists to become the social force it is at the moment. Although, of course, atheism has always been around in the 20th century, and we've had Bertrand Russell and others well before, and the arguments haven't really changed. They're still saying much the same sort of thing.
It's rather interesting that Dawkins, quite near the beginning of God Delusion, he said something similar way back. But now, he's equating, Roman Catholic nuns with Osama bin Laden. In the same bracket, he puts Christians of all kinds, fundamentalist preachers in America, but with much more orthodox people and terrorists. It's just quite remarkable that he should lump everyone together in that kind of way.
So that's an example of what I think you need to do when you want to look behind what looks like a conflict between a scientific view and a religious doctrine, and actually perhaps this might be a proxy battle that's being fought between the new atheists and militant Islam. Bizarrely enough.
Interesting thought. Yeah. Yeah, Dave.
The other half of that question was about the rise of, if you like, fundamentalist anti-science religious views. And I think not just in Islam, and not just in certain parts of Western Christianity, but also, for instance, in Hinduism. We're seeing around the world quite a rise in more fundamentalist and really anti-science aspects of religion. Any comment on that historically?
In India in particular, again, we may be looking at a proxy argument, which has got a lot to do with colonialism, and a lot to do with science being seen as a Western import, together with various other Western imports which are perhaps less desirable. In the Islamic world, creationism, young earth creationism, simply doesn't exist. There is a growing interest in what I think is called, what we call intelligent design, and some of the materials from the US have been taken around the Islamic world. But there's also a fairly vocal constituency in the Islamic world that not only says that evolution is perfectly compatible with Islam, they also claim that Islam invented it in the Middle Ages. So as a way of legitimating Darwinism. I don't necessarily think that there is a rise in fundamentalism. I think what we're seeing is, as society, as most people who are religious, I can perhaps speak for myself, have become relatively more liberal on certain doctrines, such as the literal interpretation of Genesis or the existence of hell or something like that. People who have stayed where they were, who continue to take much more traditional interpretations, begin to look a bit like mountaintops as the floods recede. So they become much more obvious. But I think that's because mainstream religion has become much more accommodating to all aspects of modern life, and that has meant that people who have effectively stayed where they were, and most of what we call fundamentalism would not have looked out of order at all in 1900. But that's just my point of view.
Interesting. Yes.
To what extent do you think the media has deliberately magnified and distorted the proportions of fundamentalist and minority views on both sides?
Well, I think they exaggerate how pervasive and how influential they are. But I don't know. I wouldn't say they necessarily exaggerate what they can find people who honestly do believe that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago, and that all gay people are automatically going to burn in hell. There are people around that think that, and the media think these people are terribly exciting. So I don't think they have to exaggerate their views, they just have to exaggerate their influence.
John, you had a point.
Yeah, I wonder if I could follow up what you were saying about Islam and creationism. It kind of runs counter to, if you like, anecdotal evidence, but strong evidence from two friends of mine who teach at the University of London, teach biology, and they say that large numbers of their Islamic students refuse to accept evolution.
I think I was happy to be reviewing a book for Rodney, which had a couple of chapters on this just the other week. We need to be quite careful about Islam in the West and how that reacts with evolution and the Islamic world as a whole. If you are a Muslim in Bradford, you probably have a very different view about Western science than if you are a Muslim in Lebanon or Egypt. And I don't think we can necessarily draw too many lessons as to how people making generalised distinctions about Islam on the basis of what Muslim students in the UK are saying. I think Muslim students in the UK are probably reacting against Richard Dawkins, whereas Muslim students in Egypt probably aren't.
So it's a local phenomenon.
Sorry?
It's a local phenomenon.
Well, I think everything is local. And I think certainly with a religion like Islam, which simply has no monolithic leaders at all, and is much, much more disparate than we Westerners often understand it to be, to make a generalisation about Islam and creationism is just not worth doing.
Okay, that's very helpful.
That is interesting, yes, thank you. I could perhaps raise one. I mean, obviously, with this grand overview, you've had to be very, very selective. But I wondered, in the anniversary year of the Royal Society, 350 years, whether it's worth saying a bit about the foundation of the Royal Society and the religious motivations of a number of people, Robert Boyle and...
Well, of course, the Royal Society had quite a bumpy beginning. And it was a subscription society, so they needed to have enough members to pay the subscriptions, and that makes it quite difficult to get to the bottom of what the motivations actually were. You've got Thomas Spratt's history, and he was a bishop.
Yeah,
and he was...
And a number of them were, I think that's the point of it.
Yes.
Wilkins, the first secretary and so on.
But I think when you look, I mean, and Merton, of course, Robert Merton, who was a sociologist, an American sociologist in the mid-20th century, he suggested that the Royal Society was effectively a Puritan organisation. I think when you get down to it, the Royal Society, the early Royal Society, begins to look like something which didn't really have much of an ideology.
Right.
And didn't even have a scientific ideology. Spratt comes up with these post-factic justifications for what it does. But if you look at what the individual members were actually writing and saying at the time, you've got everything from Henry Moore and the Cambridge Platonists to Robert Boyle, a solid Anglican clergyman, Isaac Newton, a very unorthodox religion, and all with very different ideas about science as well. So I think, once again, the history of the Royal Society is a history of particulars. It's not a history where we can try and just put that institution into a particular box and say, this is the sort of... It's a scientific institution, certainly, but that's a very, very wide-ranging category.
A number of them would have been doing natural theology and John Ray and...
that's true, yes. Yes, that was always an element of what members were doing.
Yeah.
And natural theology goes from people who were doing really quite solid naturalism, looking at different kinds of creatures, to people who, on the other extreme, were trying to produce something which they called mosaic science, which was a science that was solidly based on a literal reading of Genesis. And natural theology encompassed sort of both points of view.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just to ask, when you said before that maybe religion or Christianity is accommodating to science, I think you say that. Are you saying that as in a sense that's a smart move, or are you saying that in a negative sense?
Well, I think it's a smart move. I think one of the things that annoys me rather slightly about when new atheists are talking is that when new evidence comes along and science has changed their mind, that's a counter to triumph.
Yes.
When new evidence comes along and religious people change their mind, that's a setback.
Yes.
And I think that's not fair. And I think that we are fully entitled to continue to develop our religious and theological thinking, certainly on a basis of discovering more and more about how the world works. And I don't think that's a setback, I think that's progress.
Yes, I mean, the Roman Catholic Church back in the time of Thomas Aquinas thought that you know, the person became a person at 40 days or whatever, you know, if it's a male and a different for female. Well, you know, that's the 13th century. They don't think that now. Well, they're not allowed to change their mind, but that's brought up against them in these sort of debates. Oh, any more questions? Gosh, I really must have to silence. It'll be the first time of the weekend. Okay. I've got a few more minutes if you want to.
Can you go just the last quick one? That you've done all the history. What about the future? Can you predict the future? Where will this go? Is the science-religion conflict going to pass now, or will it always be there because of the nature of people?
I think we're currently in a bit of a peak of conflict because of creationism. I think creationism will pass, and I think we should therefore perhaps in the medium term see a rather more relaxed relationship. But there's always a potential for further conflict down the line. I think one area where Christians are beginning to get a little bit nervous, perhaps needlessly, is the area of neuroscience. I'm totally relaxed about neuroscience because even if I'm told that I'm a completely physical creature, that doesn't mean that God, in His absolute power, can't resurrect me later on in heaven, or as a perfect body, or whatever it is. I think it's all very vague theologically. But we've got hold of this Platonic idea that we're supposed to have this disembodied soul. I don't think that's a Christian idea. I think that's a Greek pagan idea, but it's got mixed up. And I think neuroscience is probably going to give the Platonic soul the idea that we've got a ghost in the machine, sort of that can float around and act independently of our bodies, which I think the New Testament is pretty clear you cannot do. Rather than get too worried about some Greek sages being disproved.
Interesting. Yes. We've had a bit of discussion about that over the last couple of days. Any more? This is great. Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, James.